the girl stepped into a puddle on the roadside, but she accidentally traveled back to 500 years ago. At that time, the king and his ministers were gathering around the water tank to ask for rain, but the girl mistakenly thought they were making a movie. Then the king asked her who she was. She replied that she was a senior high school student, but the king didn't know what that meant. He asked his men who were standing by. He didn't know either, but he was afraid of the king's chastisement. He lied and said the girl was a servant girl who had been thrown out of the palace. Now she must be angry and come to take revenge. Then the king sent his men to surround the girl. The girl thought they were joking, but when she touched it she realized it was the real thing. At this moment, the minister begging for rain on the side hurriedly told them to stop. He said the girl was a god sent from heaven to help them ask for rain. Tell them to treat her well. When the girl heard that, she also reacted. In order to save her life, she shouted like on TV. All ministers have begun to kneel down, but the girl took the opportunity to escape. Then she changed into the minister's clothes and prepared to leave, but she dropped her cell phone. She was caught by the king's guards while reaching for it. The king took the girl's mobile phone. The picture on her phone happened to be raining. The king asked her if she was the goddess of heaven who had come to ask for rain. The girl explained that her name was Dan Fei. She is just a student who has traveled from the future, and the thing she was holding was called a mobile phone. What the king saw was just a weather forecast.
제가 생각해도 너무 멀리서 황당하긴 한데요. 이거는 그냥 비가 아니라 날씨 알려주는 어플 같은 거?
이 물건으로 날씨를 알 수 있단 말이야.
He looked at this strange thing in his hand, but he accidentally turned on the camera. He was terrified. The guards thought that Dan Fei could do some kind of magic. He suggested that the king should execute her. The king thought it was a good idea. He drew his sword and aimed it at Dan Fei. A girl accidentally traveled to ancient times.
저 미래에 살았어요. 저 모르는 거 없어요. 저 다 물어보세요. 독사도 잘하고 조선? 태정태세 민다세? 선생님! 저 수학 잘해요. 산수!
She lied that she was good at arithmetic. The king believed her and gave her a puzzle. The girl thought she was in deep trouble, but she found out that she had learned this difficult problem since she was a child, although she was not a good student. But when faced with such a simple problem, Dan Fei gave the answer in less than 2 minutes. The king was shocked. He not only spared her, but also rewarded her with a big golden treasure, and kept her in the palace as his personal teacher. On the first day of class, Dan Fei realized that the king was too stupid. He couldn't even learn the simplest primary school maths, so she could only teach him the basics. But fortunately, the king was very motivated. He studied hard every day. He even wrote the multiplication algorithm on his hand. It wasn't long before the king was given his first exam by Dan Fei.
9구단을 외자 49
36
9구단을 외자
63
18 9구단을 외자 85
Watching the king being beaten, the guards directly drew their swords and aimed them at Dan Fei, and his men rushed inside. He shouted that Dan Fei would be executed, but then the king suddenly laughed. He threw his men out of the room, but just as the two of them were about to continue answering the questions, the queen came over. Dan Fei was surprised to find she looked exactly like her modern-day best friend. The empress came to bring food to the emperor, but this is no ordinary meal. It's filled with herbs prepared by the prime minister. As long as his majesty eats it, she'll soon be pregnant with his majesty's child. But just as the king was about to eat, Dan Fei's stomach was growling. The king gave all the food to Dan Fei. At night, the queen went to look for the king with great anticipation, but the king rejected her. And just as the queen was surprised, Dan Fei walked out from the side with a flushed face. A modern girl accidentally traveled to ancient times. She becomes the king's personal teacher. She not only teaches him knowledge every day, she even cooks modern food in the palace kitchen. When she handed the king the fried rice cake, the king acted very disgusted, but after he took a bite, he was instantly impressed by the flavor. He snatched the rice cake away from Dan Fei and ate it, but this also caused irritation to the king's stomach and intestines. The next morning, the king was in bed in pain. The doctor diagnosed him, but he just pasted an exorcism rune for the king. Dan Fei was very helpless. She summoned all the royal doctors, and used what she learnt in biology class to impart various knowledge to the imperial physicians. Then she wrote a medical syllabus. Then she used her knowledge of agriculture, and then she wrote an outline of agricultural science. Their relationship grew closer and closer. When the queen's father learned about he is afraid that his daughter will fall out of favor, so he had special herbs put into the emperor's food. He wanted his daughter to become pregnant with the king's child as soon as possible, but he didn't realize Dan Fei ate all the food. When the queen finds the king at night, Dan Fei came out from the side with a red face. The queen's father was extremely angry upon learning about this matter. He directly charged Dan Fei with treason, but the king sent his guards to save her in time and tried to keep her on the grounds that she was a god. But the ministers said, if Dan Fei wants to prove himself as a sky god, then she must be within 3 days. Create a water clock that can calculate time. Otherwise, she would be executed immediately. The king had no choice but to agree. The girl accidentally traveled to ancient times and taught the king how to multiply. But she was to be executed for falling in love with the king. At a critical moment, the king dispatched his own guards to save him, but due to the opposition of the palace ministers, Dan Fei must in 3 days to make a water clock that can predict the time. Otherwise, she would be executed. When she was at her wit's end, the king's guards offered to help. Dan Fei regained her confidence. Her guards helped her prepare the tools. She began to study in her physics book. 3 days passed. Dan Fei water clock was ready, but the time measurement was not accurate. The king also knows that Dan Fei must be doomed this time, so he had his guards send her out of the palace. But just as the two were taking a break midway through, the guards suddenly drew their swords. Dan Fei turned her head in surprise. At that moment, the guard stabbed out. It turned out to be an assassin sent by the minister. He asked Dan Fei to leave first. He stayed behind to deal with the assassins behind. But Dan Fei had never ridden a horse before. Just as she was about to fall off the horse, suddenly, a familiar rhythm began to play in her head. Dan Fei successfully escaped. She ran to a beach, and when she didn't know where to go, the king, who was worried about her safety, came after her. She threw her arms around Dan Fei. The two of them spent a wonderful night by the sea. The next morning, Dan Fei was washing her face on the beach when she found a pile of moss. She thought of something. She asked the king to take her back to the palace as quickly as possible. She found the reason why the water clock wasn't measuring right, because the bamboo tube from which the water comes out is stuffed with moss. She succeeded in making her water clock in front of all the ministers. The king gave Dan Fei a position of honor, but Dan Fei doesn't know that he's been made the king's concubine. The girl is planning to sneak into the imperial kitchen and cook instant noodles, but she happened to see the empress eating the noodles. So she immediately prepared the instant noodles and shared them with the queen. The empress took a bite. She was instantly impressed by the flavor of the noodles. Dan Fei told the queen that she looked just like her best friend, and the queen also felt very friendly when she saw Dan Fei. Then she took out a painting. She said she wanted to embroider stars on the dress, but she doesn't know how the effect will be. Dan Fei said she could try it herself. She took out a hobby knife and opened the drawing. Then she aimed at the stars on the outside. The dress was decorated with stars. The queen was very happy about it. Her resentment towards Dan Fei was gone. The next morning, she found the Empress Dowager. She told her that the king was very fond of Dan Fei, so she wants them to be together. At that moment, Dan Fei heard about this from her men. Then she realized that she had become a concubine. She sneaked out. The king wanted to find Dan Fei, but he learnt of Dan Fei escape. Dan Fei hid in the study where they used to study together, and the king came looking for her. When he poked his head in to see what was going on, the king appeared in front of her. He took Dan Fei by the wrist and took her to his chambers. But Dan Fei mistakenly thought that the king wanted to have a child with her. She was in a panic. She said she was just a high school student and a child, but the king laughed. Dan Fei panicked and took out his own pocket knife. A girl accidentally traveled back to ancient times. She mistakenly thought that the king wanted her to have a child. She took out a small knife and confronted the king. The king hugged her and told her she was just joking with him. He told Dan Fei he wouldn't force her to do anything she didn't like, but the queen mother gave the order. So he asked Dan Fei to cooperate with him in acting. In the middle of the night, they slept in separate beds, but Dan Fei still felt very embarrassed. The next morning, Dan Fei prepares to meet the queen mother, but when she saw the queen mother, tears came to her eyes, because she looked exactly like Dan Fei modern-day mother. She asked Dan Fei what happened, but Dan Fei just cried her heart out. At night, the king found Dan Fei to give her a surprise. He took her to his study. When she entered, she was shocked. The room was filled with the modern words that Dan Fei taught the king. He sat Dan Fei down and put a hairpin on her head.
해가 뜨고 지는 한 계속 내 옆에 있어. 이번엔 진짜 어명이다. 내 정음으로 제일 처음 적어본 세 글자이다. 내 직접 하산 너의 이름.
Dan Fei was touched by the king's words, but she told the king that the rainy season was coming. She missed her mother. She was ready to go home. She took off the pin the king had given her. Then he apologized to the king. The king angrily turned around and left. He reminisced about what he and Dan Fei had been through, but what he didn't know was, Dan Fei was suddenly knocked unconscious by an assassin in his study. Then he stabbed down with a sword. Then the assassin started a fire in the house. The girl unexpectedly traveled back to ancient times and fell in love with the king, but she was also ambushed by the assassin as a result. The assassin knocked her out while the king was away. Then he set fire to the room. When the king got the news, he rushed here. He disregarded the obstruction of the surrounding ministers. He rushed into the fire without hesitation. He soon found a fainting Dan Fei in the flames. He took her into his arms. At this point, the king also understood. If he insisted on keeping Dan Fei with him, this will definitely only harm her. Fortunately, Dan Fei didn't get hurt. The assassin's knife was blocked by her bag, and Dan Fei relied on her keen hearing. She identified the minister who had assassinated her. The king executed him on the spot. It was the end of the story, and Dan Fei realized it was time to leave. She gave the king her notebooks. The future development of the entire country will use this type of writing. She urged the king to study hard. The king took Dan Fei to the sea. It was raining heavily. The king hugged Dan Fei tightly. Then she slipped from the king's arms into the water. When she opened her eyes again, she had returned to the modern world. He ran as hard as he could to the school. When she reached the classroom, she realized it was as if time had stood still and never changed. She turned the story of her relationship with the king into a comic book. A year had passed. Dan Fei had gone to college. That day, on her way to school, it was raining heavily. She stepped into a puddle tentatively. This time, she didn't fall in. But a man suddenly appeared beside her holding an umbrella for her.
우리 마주친 적 있는데?